Welcome back, children. We will move on to the next concept of Keynesian theory in the chapter Determination of Income and Employment, and the concept is excess demand. What is this excess demand? Let me read the definition for you. Excess demand refers to a situation when aggregate demand is more than aggregate supply corresponding to the full employment level of output in the economy. You have learned the concept of full employment, over full employment and underemployment level. Three concepts you learned in the last videos. I hope you can recollect what is meant by full employment level. What is a full employment level or full employment equilibrium? The point where aggregate demand intersect the aggregate supply, or the point where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply is known as full employment level. Now, you will have an aggregate supply curve which is 45-degree line and aggregate demand curve which starts from the y-axis. Both these curves intersect at a point and forms full employment equilibrium. Now, if the aggregate demand increases in the economy, what happens? You have learned that the aggregate demand curve will shift upwards and a new equilibrium point will be maintained. Aggregate supply remains to be constant, but aggregate demand increases means what? The aggregate demand curve will shift upwards and this new aggregate demand curve will intersect the existing aggregate supply curve in another point. There an equilibrium is maintained. That equilibrium is known as over full employment equilibrium. So you have learned about over full employment equilibrium, full employment equilibrium and underemployment equilibrium, which happens when aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply. So you are very familiar with the concept, three concepts. In that we are discussing now about the full employment equilibrium situation, where we can explain, connected with that we can explain excess demand. So the definition, excess demand refers to a situation when aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply corresponding to the full employment level of output. This is the importance, there the importance of full employment level exists. So corresponding to the level of full employment level, corresponding to the level of full employment level. What is full employment level? A point where aggregate demand intersect the aggregate supply. That is known as full employment level. Corresponding to that full employment level, if the aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, we can call it as excess demand. An important point is that excess demand give rise to inflationary gap. It is very important from the examination point of view. This excess demand creates inflationary gap. So what is excess demand? A situation where aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply corresponding to the full employment level. Okay. Now we will see what is this excess demand with the help of a diagram. This is the diagram. Now, aggregate demand greater than aggregate supply means the total expenditure of the economy is increasing. Aggregate demand, people are demanding more in the economy. Therefore, the planning to buy or the aggregate demand or the total expenditure of the economy is increasing, being the supply to be constant, aggregate supply to be constant. Now, let us learn the concept of excess demand or inflationary gap. So, excess demand is also known as inflationary gap with the help of this diagram. Now, this diagram is very familiar to you, where we mark income or output or employment in the x-axis, aggregate demand on the y-axis. Now, you know what is this 45-degree line which is drawn here. This is aggregate supply curve. Now, aggregate demand curve AD is drawn, which starts from the y-axis. Why is aggregate demand starting from y-axis? Because you know aggregate demand is equal to C plus I. In C there is an autonomous consumption, that is even at zero level of income there is a minimum level of consumption. Therefore, it can start, aggregate demand curve can start only from the y-axis. Now, let us take the initial aggregate demand curve and aggregate supply curve. This is the initial aggregate supply curve AS, which is a 45-degree line. Now this is an aggregate demand curve, initial aggregate demand curve. Now you can find the initial aggregate demand curve and initial aggregate supply curve is intersecting at point E. So when these two aggregate demand curve and aggregate supply curve intersect at point, that point is known as full employment equilibrium level, which you have learned in the last videos. I hope it is clear to you. Now, when the aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, the concept is excess demand that we are learning. What is excess demand? Excess demand can happen when aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply. That means AD is greater than AS. This is a situation where AD is equal to AS. Now, when AD is greater than AS, what will happen? Automatically, the aggregate demand curve will shift upwards. AD greater than AS in the diagram will be represented by an upward shift of the aggregate demand curve. So, definitely a new aggregate demand curve will be formed, and that is AD1. AD1. This is AD1. It starts from here. This is AD and this is AD1. Now you can see the existing supply curve. Aggregate supply curve is not changing at all. It remains to be constant. The existing aggregate supply curve and the new aggregate demand curve. This is the new aggregate demand curve, right? This is the new aggregate demand curve. The new aggregate demand curve and existing aggregate supply curve will intersect at a point that I have given it as E1. This is known as over full employment equilibrium. This is a concept that you have learned. Okay, now the concept that you have to learn is excess demand. What is this excess demand? Now I hope these 2 points are clear to you, full employment equilibrium and over full employment equilibrium. Why we are explaining over full employment equilibrium here? Because when the aggregate demand curve is shifting upwards, definitely an equilibrium point will be formed, new equilibrium point. Why? Because the new aggregate demand curve will again intersect with the existing aggregate supply curve E1 at point E1. Therefore, that is over full employment equilibrium point. Now, what we have to learn here is excess demand. What is excess demand? Excess demand is a situation where aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply corresponding to the full employment equilibrium level. It is very, very important point that is to be noted. Corresponding to the full employment equilibrium point. Which is a full employment equilibrium point? This is the full employment equilibrium point. From that particular point, corresponding to that point, from that particular point, what is the gap of the new aggregate demand curve? From this equilibrium point E, what is the gap to the new aggregate demand curve? That gap is known as inflationary gap. So that gap here is EF. That gap here is EF. So what is excess demand? A situation where aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply corresponding to the full employment equilibrium level. Full employment equilibrium level is E. Corresponding to that, what is the gap to the new AD curve? That gap is known as inflationary gap. So that gap here is EF. EF is the gap. Okay. Now here I can give it as OM as the income level. So the income level is OM. Now this is the aggregate demand. Now you can just mark this aggregate demand parallel to this side. So this will be aggregate demand, isn't it? Now previously it was ME, now it is MF, which means a gap of EF is given there. That is aggregate demand greater than aggregate supply. This is known as excess demand or inflationary gap. So the gap of E to F, that means where the aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply corresponding to the full employment level is known as inflationary gap. This is very, very important from the examination point of view. Okay, so inflationary gap or excess demand is a situation where aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply corresponding to the full employment level. So you should not get confused with two equilibrium points here. That is why specifically I have mentioned overfull employment equilibrium also. Let overfull employment equilibrium be there itself. What we need to discuss here is from the full employment equilibrium point, what is the gap to the new aggregate demand curve? That gap is known as inflationary gap. So you have learned one point, and excess demand can always create inflationary gap in the economy. So hope it is clear to you. Now we will see what are the reasons for this excess demand, how excess demand can happen in the economy. Point number 1, rise in the propensity to consume. This concept is very clear to you, isn't it? What is propensity to consume? When the income increases, consumption also increases. But sometimes people increases consumption to a large extent by reducing their savings. So propensity to consume, especially for the poor people, this propensity to consume will be more and more, right? You have learned that marginal propensity to consume. So propensity to consume, its increase, that is a reason for inflationary gap. So how will you explain that? Propensity to consume means what? When income increases, consumption also increases. Sometimes the increase in the consumption will be more and more, so that people will try to save only very less. When they are increasing their consumption means what? Their demand in the economy is more, their total expenditure is more. That means aggregate demand is high, as simple as that. So when aggregate demand is higher than aggregate supply, there is excess demand. So once again I repeat the point, increase in the propensity to consume means what? When there is increase in the income, consumption also increases. Sometimes increase in the consumption will be more in such a way that the propensity to save will be less. Propensity to say consume is more means aggregate demand is more. Aggregate demand is more means there is excess demand. Now reduction in taxes, it comes from the side of government. Government sometimes reduces the tax. When the government reduces the tax so as to balance certain things in the economy, you know, when the government makes changes in the taxes, you have learned in government budget and economy, isn't it? When the government reduces the tax, what will happen? That much amount of money is there within the people. So purchasing power of the people increases in the economy. So purchasing power of people increases in the economy means what? Aggregate demand is increasing. When aggregate demand is increasing, what happens in the economy? There is excess demand in the economy. So once again I repeat the point, when there is a reduction in the taxes, people gets more purchasing power because money is there within them. So the aggregate demand also increases, which means there is excess demand or inflationary gap. Now next is increase in the government expenditure. Government is spending more and more in the economy in the construction of bridges, railways, public parks, metros, everywhere. Therefore, government demand for goods and services are increasing. More and more people are getting work. So they are earning income. Government is buying goods for its construction. So money is flowing, isn't it? So more and more people are earning through the work they get due to the government projects. So they are spending for consumption. Purchasing power of the people increases due to their income. Therefore, what happens? Government demand for goods and services are increasing. Therefore, what will happen? Aggregate demand will increase. So when aggregate demand increases, it means what? Excess demand or inflationary gap. Okay, so once again, when the government invests in the projects, it demands for more goods and services. It can create more flow of money in the economy, which can again increase the purchasing power of the people, thereby increases the aggregate demand. So when aggregate demand increases means excess demand. Now the next is increase in the investment. Investment is from the part of producers. When do a producer increase his investment? In two cases. First case is when the rate of interest is very less, because he needs to make fund for investment. So he will try to make fund when the rate of interest, he will take a loan from the banks. So when the rate of interest is less, he will move for that. He will increase his investment. Second case is marginal efficiency of investment. We can recollect what is marginal efficiency of investment. What is it? The expected rate of return from the investment is known as marginal efficiency of investment. If a producer is getting an expected rate of return from his first investment, definitely he will go for the next round of investment. So his investment increases. So investment increases in an economy in two situations: when the expected rate of return from the investment is high. Secondly, when the rate of interest is less, where he can borrow the fund. So in two cases, investment can increase. If these two situations are favorable for him, investment increases in the economy, production increases. That can lead to more consumption, more demand in the economy. That can again create excess demand in the economy, which can lead to inflationary gap. Now, next is fall in the import. You know, imports are coming from outside. When the imports are less, demand for the domestic goods will increase. When the demand for the domestic good increases, our domestic producers will set the price higher than the normal level. So when there is a rise in the price, you have learned rise in price means inflation, inflationary gap occurs. So the fall in the import leads to rise in the demand for the domestic products. Domestic producers will increase the price of their product. Rise in the price means inflation. Inflationary pressure occurs in the economy. Now, the next point is rise in the export. When there is a rise in the export, there is more flow of foreign exchange to our country. When it is converted to Indian currency, the money supply increases. Flow of foreign currency, it increases the money supply. So when there is increase in the money supply, you know it is inflation again. You have learned that in money and banking. Increase in the money supply means what? Again it is inflation. So that can also create inflationary pressure in the economy. So once again, when there is a rise in the export, more flow of foreign currency to our country, money supply increases. Increase in the money supply can create inflationary pressure in the economy. Now, last point is deficit financing. You have learned this concept in money and banking, right? What is this deficit financing? Financing the government. By whom? RBI. When? In case of deficit. What is deficit? When the government expenditure is more than its revenue, that is known as deficit. During the time of deficit, where the government will go? Government will approach RBI. For what? For money. How RBI supplies money? RBI will supply money to the government by printing of currency notes against the securities submitted by the government. So in certain cases, RBI circulates more money supply equivalent to the value of foreign securities submitted by the government. It has to circulate. Sometimes that value of securities may be high, therefore money supply will be more in the economy. So when money supply comes more in the economy, when the printing of currency happens to be more in the economy than the required level, definitely money supply will increase and it can cause for inflationary pressure. So once again I will repeat for you, deficit financing means financing during the time of deficit. Who is being financed? Government. By whom government is financed? By RBI. What is RBI doing to finance government? Printing of currency notes. How it print the currency notes? Equivalent to the value of securities submitted by the government. Why government needs money? Why there is a deficit for the government? Sometimes expenditure can go more than revenue. So at that time government can approach only RBI to print currency notes, and it will be RBI will be printing the currency notes equivalent to the value of securities submitted by the government. So sometimes the printing of currency notes can be more than the required level. That can cause for increase in the money supply, which can create inflationary pressure in the economy. So what are the causes for the excess demand? Rise in propensity to consume, reduction in taxes, increase in government expenditure, increase in investment, and fall in the imports, rise in exports, and deficit financing. Now, what is the impact of this excess demand? The impact of excess demand is General price level increases. Price increases in the economy because you know price increase means what? Inflation in the economy. Everywhere price increases. Prices of all the commodities increases. It will be very difficult for the normal the people who are living with a normal level of income, isn't it? To survive in the economy. Poor people will suffer due to this inflationary pressure. Then effect on output. There is no effect. Why it is written as no effect on the output? There is no effect on the output because from the diagram it will be clear to you, because economy is already at full employment level. Therefore, there is no effect on the output. Okay, from this particular point, this gap is measured as inflationary gap. There is no change in the output level. Output is remaining to be at OM level. There is no change in the OM level. What change happened here is from ME of aggregate demand, now it has come to MF. There is no change in the output. Output remains to be constant. It is already in full employment level. Okay, now what is the next point? Effect on employment. Employment also there is no effect. That is what I told you. Income, output, employment, everything seems to be the same. Employment level also is the same. Employment of resource is the same. There is no change in the employment. I can show that to you in the diagram. Economy is already in the full employment. There is no employment level after that. From that point only that gap is measured to F as inflationary gap. So what is the impact of excess demand? No change in the employment, no change in the output, but price level is raised. That is general price level has increased. This is the impact of excess demand. This is very, very important from the examination point of view. I hope this is very, very clear to you. Thank you.